Hello, I'm Dr. Gary Stearns, Professor of History at Elizabethtown Community and Technical College. This presentation, acknowledging Africans in Roman and medieval and Renaissance history, is part of our division's De-Colonizing the Curriculum initiative in conjunction with the ECTC Office of Cultural Diversity. A common critique of Western civic classes, like my History 104, is that it starts in Mesopotamia and then works its way towards the Atlantic, hitting Greece and the Romans, and then Latin Christendom with the Dark and Middle Ages, and then finally the Renaissance and Reformation. That it basically is the lives and deeds of dead white men. In my History 104 class, I strive to include those overlooked by the mainstream narratives, particularly women, not only queens and empresses, but artists, poets, and theologians like those listed here. But also, I've strived to recognize and acknowledge Africans in European history to 1650. Africans appear at the birth of Western literature. The first literary record of Ethiopia comes from Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Ethiopia is actually a compression of the Greek words atho and ops, literally meaning burnt face. In the Iliad and Odyssey, there's lots of ambiguity about hair and skin color. Odysseus at times is described as dark-skinned, as depicted here in this vase. Most of the leading Greek figures visited Egypt. Thales, the father of rational discourse, took Egyptian geometry back to Greece. Pythagoras, Herodotus, the father of Greek history. All of these men, Solon, Plato, Democritus, Euclid, visited and borrowed from the Egyptians. Egypt became part of the empire of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Upon his death, Alexander's empire broke apart, but his general Ptolemy declared himself King Ptolemy I and set up the Ptolemaic dynasty that lasted almost 300 years. Alexandria, Egypt was the center of Hellenistic world trade culture, its famous lighthouse, harbor, university. And Ptolemy I here appears to be European. Well, he was a Macedonian, but several generations afterward, you can see the bust of Ptolemy X, he appears African. North Africa, or Carthage and its hinterlands, become part of the Roman Empire during the Republic era. There are three Punic Wars that Rome will win. And the Second Punic War has been described as a clash between Rome and Hannibal. No known depictions of Hannibal in his lifetime, but here are two after Hannibal's death depicting him as African. Carthage annexed by the Romans in 146 BC, and in that year we have the first record of the word Africa. Africa proconsularis, that meant the governor or proconsul of this province, today's Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, the area known as Numidia in the Roman era. Afra may have been a local tribe. The Romans called the natives Afars. In 32 BC, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and annexed Egypt into the Roman Empire. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had a daughter. Her name was Cleopatra Moon, Cleopatra Selene. At age 15, she wed American King Juba II. Their son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, was later executed by Caligula for wearing too splendid a cape in Rome. North African provinces were a key part of the Roman Empire. They were a granary, provided taxes, animals for the arena, and also trade conduits with sub-Saharan kingdoms. Romans made no distinction between African-born Romans and themselves. Hundreds of African Romans served in the military as state officials. They were generals and consuls, tribunes, tutors. The tutor of Marcus Aurelius was an African. They were orators, served and led the Praetorian Guard, and were provincial governors and co-emperors. Septimius Severus was known as the African emperor. He was born in present-day Libya. He founded one of the last dynasties of the Roman Empire, the Severi. They ruled from 193 to 235 AD. African Romans made remarkable contributions to Roman and Western culture. Terence, for example, was perhaps the most famous playwright. He came to Rome as a slave from Carthage, freed by his owner, and he took the name of his owner, Publius Tyrrenius. 6 comedies that he wrote were popular throughout antiquity and on into the Middle Ages. He was very influential on Renaissance-era drama. Apelles was an African-born author, an orator, a Platonic philosopher. Statues set up to him during his lifetime. His book, Metamorphos, or The Golden Ass, is the only complete surviving Latin novel. This book is the first picaresque novel, told in first person, a body story of the rogue Lysias in pursuit of a girl, a witch turned Lysias into a donkey, and he goes on to have a series of episodic misadventures before being restored to human form by the goddess Isis. Apelles' prose style was influential on Christian writers. There are 2 important Afro-Roman Christian writers. Tertullian was born in Carthage, and he coined the term Trinity, Latin Trinitas, to refer to the Christian deity. His writings promoted the use of Latin in the Western Church. Perhaps the greatest Christian theologian and the finest thinker of antiquity is St. Augustine of Hippo, the first bishop of North Africa. He is the son of a Roman colonist and a local Berber mother. Augustine's Confessions are the world's first autobiography. St. Augustine's Concerning the City of God Against the Pagans is the origins and foundation of scholasticism, the Christian philosophy of the Middle Ages. In this famous book, he used Platonic philosophy to explain the fall of Rome. The Dark and Middle Ages have a rich record of Africans in Europe. The oldest monastery in Europe is St. Marie's Abbey in the Alps of Switzerland, founded in 515 AD. Maurice was an African Christian commander of the Roman Theban legion. In 287 AD, Maurice and his legion refused orders to put down a Germanic Christian rebellion. Emperor Maximilian ordered Maurice and his entire legion to be executed. Maurice became a martyr saint, and the abbey founded in his honor. This might be the first statue of an African in medieval Europe. The Swiss cities of St. Moritz and Montrose are named after Maurice. In 711, the Moors of North Africa began their conquest of Spain. These Islamic raiders will eventually conquer and rule Spain for centuries. The Reconquista, or the Christian Reconquest, lasted about 750 years. The Pope refers to it as a holy war. It went from 742 to 1492. There are continuous contacts between the Europeans and the Moors during the Middle Ages. According to some historians, Friar Edwards and Walden, 9th century Viking fleets raided North Africa and Spain and took African captives back to Britain and Ireland. The Crusades also created continuous contact between Europeans and Egyptians. Alexandria will be attacked multiple times and became a trade center between the Arabs and the Egyptians and Africans and the Orient with Italian city-states. Richard II negotiated the end of the Third Crusade with Egyptian Sultan Al-Adin, and St. Francis of Assisi preached to Egyptian Sultan Malik al-Kamil. The Holy Roman Empire of the 13th century was ruled by the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and emperors Henry VI and Frederick II had African retainers at their court. In 1244, Frederick II toured his Germanic territories with African soldiers. He appointed an African, Johann Morarus, as the Duke of Sicily. African figures are depicted in sculpture and iconography. Africans also appear in medieval art and literature. Sir Morion the Black Knight of the Round Table was a gallant warrior in the King Arthur stories. Africans appear in medieval sculpture and art. Examples include black Madonnas like this 9th century Sicily version, or the Lady of the Song of Solomon, the prayerful lady with the crown. Also noblemen and saints. It became a medieval artistic convention to depict Balthazar, one of the famed wise men, as an African. The number of Africans in Europe exploded during the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. Prince Henry of Portugal set up trading stations along the west coast of Africa in the 1430s and 40s. The Portuguese were seeking a sea route to the Orient. The slave trade began in the 1440s. I've seen different dates, as early as 1441. It is recorded that in 1444, 235 West Africans were shipped to Lisbon, and 4 years later, the Portuguese set up a permanent slave market in Mauritania. In 1450, 1,000 African slaves were sold in Venice alone. But there were hundreds, if not a few thousand, non-slave Africans in Renaissance Europe. They were envoys, diplomats, court musicians, and servants. Here is a portrait by Alfred Dewar on the left of a 20-year-old servant, Katrina. She was a servant to a Portuguese trade official in Amsterdam. On the right, a 1597 painting of Mary Phyllis, a seamstress who arrived in England at age 6 with her father from Spain. Another portrait here of Albert Dürer of an African in 1508. Africans were artisans and craftsmen. The first steel needle maker in England was an African. They were also divers. The Europeans of the Renaissance age did not or could not swim. They thought swimming was unhealthy, and they were bad at it. They often drowned. So Africans were divers for pearls and sponges and gold and salvage. Jacques Francis, shown here, was an African diver in the salvage of the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose, which had sunk in the English Channel. He's the first African to testify in an English court. His employer was charged for theft for some of the recovered items. Here is a painting by Gentile Bellini, 1500, of the Miracle of the Cross of the Bridge of St. Lorenzo. The Holy Cross, a precious relic, has fallen into the Venice Canal. And you can see an enlarged version here in the corner of an African poised to jump into the canal to recover the cross. In 1588, it is recorded that Fernando de' Medici was saved from drowning in the Arno River by, quote, a Negro of his. Some Africans attained positions of power, like Alessandro de' Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo de' Medici. Known as the Moor or the Black Prince of Florence, Alessandro ruled Florence for 5 years as the Duke of Florence. But unsurprisingly, he will be murdered by a de Medici cousin, Lorenzo. Africans appear in many Baroque artworks, including those by Rubens and Rembrandt. Africans are documented in the courts of Tudor England and Stuart Scotland. In the 1480s, at the Scottish court of King James IV, there were many African Moors. They were servants, court musicians, and invited guests. Edinburgh's Shrove Tuesday celebration in 1505 had many Africans participating, including a drummer and choreographer. The first black royal attendant on record in Tudor England is Catalina de Cardone. She arrived in 1501 at the court of Henry VII with Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Catherine of Aragon is later the wife of Henry VIII and Queen of England. Catalina served in the royal bedchamber for 26 years. John Blanke was a black trumpeter in the court of Henry VII and Henry VIII. The 1574 warrant record lists an African, quote, blackamoor boy, unquote, in the entourage of Elizabeth I. There was a dramatic rise in the number of Africans in Tudor England from 1488 to 1602. They were not slaves. Slavery was not legal in Tudor England. There was no slave code or legislation like in Portugal, Spain, or Italy. Aristocratic households had African servants and groomsmen, including Sir Francis Drake and Sir Water Raleigh. That's how he pronounced his name, Water. Most Africans in Tudor England were free to work and wed native English. Parish records record their baptisms and burials in London, Leicester, Plymouth, Southampton, Barnstable, Bristol, Northampton, and many other places. Black prostitutes also could be found alongside white women, particularly in London. Africans also appear in the literary record of Tudor England. Shakespeare's tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. This also reveals how knowledgeable the Tudors were of the prevalence of Africans in Italy. It was an artistic trope of the 17th century for aristocratic women to be painted with African attendants. These attendants were well dressed, maybe bedecked with jewels, but they are objectified. They are staring up adoringly at their mistresses. This trope is seen here in a portrait of Oliver Cromwell, England's Lord Protector. This painting dates about 1650, which is the ending date of History 104, the middle of the 17th century. Tudor England's first effort in the slave trade was in 1562 when John Hawkins left Plymouth to capture Africans along the Guinea coast. Quote, he got into his possession, partly by the sword and partly by other means, 300 to 500 captives, with which he sailed to the West Indies. But only 125 survived, so the venture was a total failure. And the English would abandon the slave trade until the 1660s. Ironically, this slave ship was named Jesus of Lubeck. In 1518, however, the Portuguese shipped the first African slaves to Brazil. And over the next 370 years, an estimated 12 million were transported from 1518 to 1888, when Brazil finally abolished slavery. The Portuguese and Spanish dominated the slave trade to South Africa, but the French, English, and Dutch concentrated on the West Indies and North America. 3.5 million slaves were transported in British ships alone from 1662 to 1807, the date the British outlawed the slave trade. Over 2 million slaves were sent to Brazil, but the greatest number, an estimated 7 million, to the sugar plantations of the West Indies. The Middle Passage, the Atlantic voyage, was extremely arduous and horrific. An estimated 2 million slaves died at sea. At the start of the slave trade, perhaps a third perished. But shippers made, quote, improvements to reduce their losses to roughly 10%. 1650 is the end date of History 104. The 17th century is a pivotal century of the African slave trade and European colonialization, recognizing the enduring and destructive legacy of slavery and the slave trade and colonialism is a main goal of the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement in higher education. Africans in early European history is a rich and growing field in scholarship and research today. Acknowledging others, women, and Africans in early European history creates a richer, a more inclusive, and a more accurate story of the past and enhances our understanding of the present world. Thank you for viewing this presentation.